Welcome, everyone. I'm Anna Rose. I'm the Exhibition and Programming Associate at the Wende Museum. And thanks so much for tuning in today to Cold War Spaces. I'd like to welcome our guest for this episode, Stuart Schroeder. He's Associate Research Professor of Africana Studies at Johns Hopkins University, and also the Associate Director of the Program in Racism, Immigration, and Citizenship. He's also taught at Harvard and NYU. His book, Badges Without Borders, How Global Counterinsurgency Transformed American Policing, was published in 2019. And his writing has appeared in American Quarterly, Art Forum, Baffler, among various other outlets. Today's program will be about a 30-minute conversation between Stuart and Segal, the Wende's Chief Curator and Director of Programming. After that, we'll have a 15-minute Q&A session with the audience, so please get your questions ready to put in the Q&A box during that time. We appreciate everyone's questions, but please keep them short and concise, no longer than a sentence or two. And for other comments and discussion, feel free to use the chat box. It's always nice to see where people are tuning in from. So if you want to say hi and what city you're tuning in from. And please switch the blue box to host and attendees so that everyone in the audience can see your messages, not just us. And we'll be posting the recording of this program on our Vimeo page and also in audio format on our SoundCloud afterwards. And lastly, I'd like to thank Susan Horwitz and Rick Feldman for generously supporting discussion series at the Wende and our virtual programs. And now, Yusuf will start us off with the conversation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Anna Rose and Stuart. Welcome to Cold War Spaces, and thank you for joining us today. I would like to start with the question, what actually motivated you to write this book, Badges Without Borders? In your introduction, you say, although, and I quote here, although the history of policing and prisons within the United States appears grotesque, the true extent is worse. And is that what made you feel or realize that this book needed to be written?
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me today. It's really great to be here, and thanks everybody for joining on this Wednesday in August, when I'm sure people might also be interested in hiking and biking and things that we do in August. So yeah, my book Badges Without Borders really came about because I had a question, which was about the relationship between policing in the United States. And some of that came out of my own experience of living in New York City in the kind of height of the Bloomberg era, and paying attention to activism and participating in activism around policing. And then interest that I had in foreign policy. So I wondered, what was the connection between policing and US foreign policy? And of course, there were some glimpses into this relationship that I think, activists and scholars had been making for quite some time. And I point this out in my book, that particularly in the late 1960s with Black Power and other movements and formations, there were widespread critiques of the US war in Vietnam and its reverberations in US cities. So I was aware of those types of discourses, and so I just wanted to explore the connections. I thought there was a connection to explore, but I have to say that I didn't know how to do it. I had this idea in my head that this was what I was interested in, but it took quite some time to actually piece together how to do the research, how to draw the kind of theoretical and analytic connections and interpret the sources in a way that made the story all kind of hang together. But the result was the book Badges Without Borders, and I would just say that the book focuses on a period from basically the end of World War II, 1950s into the 70s. And I think that the kind of analytic framework I use of thinking about foreign policy and domestic policy and thinking about security across that divide, I think that could be applied to other time periods as well. And I know other scholars are doing that too.
Yeah, I think one of the very original and important contributions of your book is pointing out not only the simultaneous international operations and domestic policy strategies, but also how they impact each other and affect each other. Can you say in short how you see that this impact, this influence functioned and what the consequences were?
Yeah. Well, the book focuses on a somewhat obscure agency within the US government called the Office of Public Safety. And the Office of Public Safety existed officially from 1962 until 1974, 1975, although it had precursors that existed, starting earlier, and I kind of trace how it comes into existence. The Office of Public Safety never employed more than a few hundred advisors, and the advisors, they were called public safety advisors. What they did was train police officers and assist police officers of other countries around the globe. And ultimately, the Office of Public Safety operated in over 50 countries around the globe, in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And it also operated a training academy, two training academies, but the long-lasting one was in Washington, D.C., called the International Police Academy, which operated from 1963 to 1975, and 77 countries sent their police officers to the International Police Academy. And so I look at the Office of Public Safety, and one of the things I found when I started to look into it, and again, going back to what I said earlier, I didn't know about OPS really. Maybe I'd encountered it, in passing and reading, but when I set out to write the book, or which started as my dissertation, the first kind of proposal, the words Office of Public Safety don't appear in it. I only kind of encountered it in my research, and it kind of clicked that this was this was both the vehicle for the analysis I wanted to do, again, of bringing together foreign and domestic pieces of history, but also that it was the kind of connecting point for foreign and domestic spheres. And the reason was that these public safety advisors generally were retired police officers from around the United States. They did not necessarily, some of them did have specialized training. Many of them were veterans of previous wars, but they weren't, they weren't somebody that you would see in a kind of thriller movie who has, great expertise, rigorous training. Many of them are kind of older guys who've had a career in policing within the United States. They were experts at regular old-fashioned policing in the United States, and they're deployed overseas to help train and upgrade and assist police officers around the globe as part of the Cold War, as part of trying to prevent the expansion of the Soviet or Chinese spheres of influence, of course, under the principle of containment, trying to prevent the expansion of the communist movement and even trade union movements in again, Latin America, Africa, and parts of Asia. And the idea was that in order to prevent revolution, in order to prevent subversive movements and even guerrilla warfare from breaking out, the United States would equip police with the most kind of up-to-date training, technology, and tools. And they would therefore be able to prevent strikes, they would be able to prevent demonstrations, they would be able to prevent riots, they would be able to prevent governments from ultimately falling, US-friendly governments from falling. And so it was this kind of realization that these guys who were doing this work, again, they had some specialized training, but they weren't, cloak and dagger operators. They were police officers, many of them well-known police officers. They were kind of at the top of the profession. They would publish in police publications, journals and magazines, so that they weren't totally inexperienced. In fact, they were very experienced, but just at regular style policing.
So they brought their domestic experience abroad, but what did they take home from their experiences in an international arena?
Yeah, that's a great question. The book on the one hand focuses on exactly as you say, what they brought overseas, and then it also focuses on what they brought back home. And I would say that they brought back home some kind of intellectual insights about controlling subversive movements. They brought back the experience of having tested technologies that weren't necessarily widely used in the United States, but were then tested in the kind of counterinsurgency theater overseas, or counterinsurgency space, to use our title today. And so some of these are extremely mundane. The walkie-talkie, it's hard to imagine a police officer in the United States in 2021 without a walkie-talkie. And of course, they also have smartphones and so forth. But in the mid-1960s, not every police department outfitted its officers with walkie-talkies. But the United States put so much resources, R&D resources, into developing cheap, durable walkie-talkies for overseas use, that eventually they realized, well, these are actually pretty useful, and remarkably, they've become remarkably cheap. So we can start using them at home. So it's just, again, these mundane technologies. But then, of course, also I have a whole chapter focusing on tear gas, the widespread adoption of tear gas, and specifically a chemical called CS in the United States is another effect here. The helicopter, I don't really focus on the helicopter in the book. It could be a whole chapter. I know other researchers are working on exploring the adoption of the helicopter within the United States. There's just a brand new article that has just come out by a guy called Brendan Hornbostel, which it has great insights into this process. So there's a lot of technologies that we now think of as ubiquitous policing technologies that are actually coming out of the counterinsurgency experience at the height of the Cold War. And just one last thing I will say is that another focal point in the book is literally just the idea of using Washington's resources, which are of course huge, to help upgrade policing. This was not an idea that anybody was really adhering to before the 1960s. Now, of course, we know in the 1960s, fears of crime, highly racialized, racist fears of crime in the 1960s, fears of political unrest during the 1960s within the US. These inspire elected officials, policymakers, and of course, voters as well, to demand greater investments in law and order, as it was called at the time. Well, Washington does commit to, the Johnson administration and Congress, they commit to using Washington's resources, the federal purse, for local law enforcement. But when they do it, the model they draw upon is the model of the Office of Public Safety, which is basically doing the same thing overseas. It's taking US experts, US resources, US know-how, spreading it around the globe to local police forces. And a number of policymakers, as I explained in the book, say, hey, let's do the same thing domestically. And that leads to the 1968 crime bill and the creation of the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration, which is a pretty large, somewhat not well-liked bureaucracy that came into existence in 1968 and lasted until 1982. And it's really the domestic version of the Office of Public Safety.
Right. I want to follow up on that, because you argue in your book that in the 1960s, with the urban unrest, etc., there were actually two different strategies under consideration. One was, as you mentioned, the upgrading and professionalization of police forces. The other way to go was to take away the causes of unrest, fighting racism, fighting social inequality, promoting jobs, housing, things like that. How did this balance turn in the direction of policing and preventing and suppressing unrest?
Yeah, it's a really important question that I think is on people's minds today. Certainly after the summer of 2020, the widespread protests in all 50 states, even very small towns, where I think a lot of people were really demanding, recognizing that there are deep social problems. The kind of US social life is fractured along lines of race, ethnicity, immigration status, and so forth. And throwing police at these problems doesn't seem to solve them. And yet, as we're seeing today, you know, in the headlines, literally today, you know, what we're seeing is although there seems to be among the Democratic Party a commitment to spending for some alleviation of inequality and poverty, there's also a really strong commitment to spending money on policing, right? So a similar thing, you know, happened in the 1960s. There was a widespread consensus that we should focus on root causes. We meaning the American public, the taxpayer, should invest in education, housing, healthcare, jobs, and so forth. Many people believe this, but they didn't win the debate. Ultimately, the kind of law and order, law enforcement, you know, people who wanted to strengthen law enforcement, they won the debate. And I would argue, and I do argue in the book, that part of the reason is because law enforcement actors themselves make this argument. They say, listen, it might be a great idea to alleviate poverty, but it's going to take a really long time. And in the meantime, we have crime, we have disorder, we have unrest, we have violence. So in the short term, we need a strong, robust police force. And because this argument comes from police officers themselves, law enforcement figures themselves, as well as, you know, many elected officials who are allied with them, and because they have been an instrument for waging the Cold War, for fighting, you know, for democracy around the globe, as I illustrate, I think they're taken quite seriously when they make this argument, which again is, in the short term, we have to have order, even if in the long term it might make sense to, you know, strengthen the social safety net or whatever. I mean, you know, some cops are totally opposed to, you know, any kind of, you know, spending on social welfare, but some of them say, you know, yeah, sure, do it, but make sure we get the investment in resources first. And what I would just point out is, like, you know, look, that is what happened. And still today we get the argument, which is, well, it would be nice to, you know, fix the problems of, you know, healthcare and inadequate housing and all the rest. But, you know, we have a crime problem on our hands and we have to deal with it now. And I would just say, if 70 years ago, a huge investment had been made in, you know, jobs and housing and healthcare, particularly for African Americans and the growing Latinx population at the time, you know, we perhaps wouldn't be having this argument, you know, 70 years later, because that if that investment had been made, we might not have such a, you know, grossly unequal society. You know, of course, it's a big counterfactual, but when I hear the argument today of, you know, let's deal immediately with the problem that is occurring and you know, push the dealing with root causes down the road, you know, it's very familiar. It's very familiar. This is an argument I've heard before.
And you see the same hesitation to really act right now comparable to 70 years ago, or yeah, right. Let's talk a bit about one aspect of these problems, racism. So in the context of the Cold War, the Soviet Union used American racism to feed their propaganda and to show how American capitalism works out in terms of unequal treatment of minorities and specifically African Americans. How did American policymakers respond to that Soviet accusation? Did they try to improve the situation, and where does the police come in this story, in this narrative?
Yeah. Well, yeah, a number of scholars, of course, have written on this topic, and we have a pretty, I think, strong understanding of the ways that both the communist movement within the United States and more liberal currents in the civil rights movement, including the NAACP, you know, emphasized that the racism that was occurring within the United States toward African Americans, gave the lie to some of the claims that the United States was making on a global stage about its championing of freedom and liberty in contrast to the Soviet Union. And of course, the Soviet Union, China, and even eventually Cuba, capitalized on this. And I should also mention, it's important to mention in the context of my book and what I look at, the National Liberation Front in Vietnam, emphasizes as well. What they say is, in fact, actually, the United States is not a beacon of freedom, is not a beacon of equality or liberty. Now, what we know from other scholars is that the State Department and many policymakers, all the way up to and including John F. Kennedy, for example, were quite concerned about this. They were worried that because the majority of the people on the planet are not white, they might be convinced to find common cause with the people within the United States who are experiencing racism. And then all of a sudden, again, there was a risk of the expansion of the communist sphere because of the kind of propaganda war, the United States losing the propaganda war. Now, I think there's some debate about how sincere or how cynical some of this propaganda was on the part of the Soviet Union. Of course, we also know that there have been and are oppressed minorities in many of these parts of the globe as well. But for me, what was so interesting was looking at these police experts who are tasked with building what they call the first line of defense against communism. They are quite aware that police, their colleagues, are being accused of racism, are being accused of brutality. So as they're enrolled in the foreign policy sphere and they're becoming workers working in the foreign service, they're sensitive to criticisms that police are agents of bigotry and so forth. Now, I think the real paradox that I try to explore in the book is that is the question of, is it possible for a kind of liberal vision of policing that they espouse to dispense with racism, bigotry, brutality as it's spread across the globe? And this just provided or produced a real challenge for these actors. And I think that they were not, even if they intellectually understood the problem, I think they were not practically well equipped to do anything about it, because there's something inherent to policing, which is about the way that it relies on assessments of risk, assessments of suspicion, and these are always cast in population-wide terms, who within the population is suspicious, and it inherently tends to fall on minoritized groups. Now, of course, when they go to Southeast Asia, when they go to Latin America, the kind of ideas about race that they bring with them from the United States, the model of black-white race relations in the United States, it doesn't necessarily apply when they go overseas. This doesn't, I think one interpretation of this could be, well, so therefore they throw it out. I would say no, they don't throw it out. They reconfigure it. They mold it in new ways, and I think this just kind of points us to the necessity of being somewhat flexible in our understandings of how race and racism work. That even in the absence of a kind of black-white racial binary, as you would encounter in Southeast Asia, that doesn't mean that there isn't still a possibility of racism, of discrimination, of group-wide suspicion, and so forth. And so trying to dig into some of that, I mean, this is a complex and multifaceted story, and it's going to be a different story in different places. I was not trying to give a close view of many different racial regimes in different places, but I was trying to say, look, the police experts that I examine are aware of this problem, but they can't get out of this problem. And that to me is really interesting.
Right. How would you compare that situation in the 1960s, 70s with our time, the time of Black Lives Matter? So much has come to the fore these past few years. What has changed?
You know, on my more cynical days, I would say not much. And you know, I think that it's important to recognize, and I think that this is something I try to do in my research. It's important to recognize that the institution of policing is adaptable. It changes in response to criticisms it receives. You know, all of the figures I look at, they would identify themselves as reformers. They believe in police reform. But I think it's very important for us to recognize that police reform is really actually mainly designed to protect the institution, to maintain its kind of stability and integrity, rather than undermine it. You know, in fact, the resistance to reform might lead to police being undermined, to its power and credibility and legitimacy being weakened. And so the figures I look at, they're trying to maintain the legitimacy, the power, the integrity of police forces, and of course the governments that they are employed by. So they're willing to be reformers. They're willing to change the kind of technical repertoires. They're willing to adopt new technologies. They're willing to even adopt new language and discourses and ideas. And the reason is because they want to maintain the essential role of police in protecting what they understand as a kind of liberal capitalist society. I don't think that configuration has changed. I think there are also, you know, the balance of forces within policing changes from decade to decade. At some points, the reformers have a little bit more power. Certainly in the Obama administration, when I started writing the book during the Obama administration, I finished it, of course, during the Trump administration. I would say the reformers were on the ascendance during the Obama administration. The kind of more liberal figures within policing, certainly the sort of internationalists who very much were similar to the figures I looked at during the 1960s. They were liberal reformer internationalists. By the time I'm finishing the book under the Trump administration, those folks are a little bit less powerful. They have a little bit less sway, and now a kind of more conservative, revanchist force within policing that is a little bit less interested in reformism. They are being courted by the White House. So paying attention to those different kind of forces within policing and how they try to prescribe different models, again, for maintaining the integrity of policing and the kind of cohesiveness of the force. You know, that's something that is interesting to me, and I try to analyze in the historical period I look at in the book, but I think could be really useful continuing as we think about policing today.
Right, and that might be something that we can discuss during the Q&A, whether you think police can be reformed, whether it should be defunded, as some people argue. Before we go to the Q&A, which is almost now, and please put your questions under the Q&A box where I will read them, I would like to ask you one related final question. And it is that many people accept that some form of state power is necessary to defend the principles of civil society. But then on the other hand, when does defending civil society become so repressive that any form of resistance and alternative visions are being suppressed? So what is the illiberal moment of liberalism, if you will?
Yeah, I mean, this is really, you know, this gets to the heart of what the book is about. You know, I'm not a political philosopher or political theorist, and some of these questions, you know, these types of questions, or thinking about these questions, can get us into somewhat abstract terrain. And you know, what I found with the historical actors that I look at, they were very strongly convinced that the protection of, you know, liberal civil society required strong, adept policing. what I found is that the empowering of police in this way oftentimes undermined or vitiated the liberal freedoms of civil society. This was true within the United States, and this was true around the globe. And it just kind of strikes me that, what it means is that relying on police to keep, liberal civil society intact is a very risky proposition. Now, I'm not an anarchist, although I'm friends and interlocutors with anarchists, and we have different takes on some of these questions. But to me, I guess what I would say is that there is a notion going back to the earliest moments of the Enlightenment, when the word police first starts to get used by political philosophers, when it first comes into the English language, and the genealogy of it is fascinating, and many scholars have looked at it. But the notion of police that we start out with centuries ago is about a kind of protection of a kind of delimited sphere, perhaps the family, from threats. And police really means being able to, it's a power to identify and kind of constrain or control threats to the, kind of present day and future well-being of this, collective, whether again, family or something larger. I don't know that it's possible to eliminate that notion from our civil society, that there could be some kind of power to protect and preserve. However, the kind of bureaucratized version that comes into being with the rise of capitalism in the 17th, 18th, 19th century, I think gets us farther and farther away from that original notion. And we're just left with a question of how could we have a police power to protect people, to protect collectivities, that isn't the bureaucratic version of police, the person in uniform with the badge and a gun that we have nowadays. This is a very complicated question. And I think it's really the question that abolitionists have put on the table in a really powerful way in recent years, or at least it's become a more mainstream conversation in recent years. And I don't think anybody would argue that there's a simple answer to it. But I think there's a widespread consensus that where we are now in our current arrangement is not really doing the job, that the kind of bureaucratic instruments that we have, the agency we call police, has really strayed quite far from this older notion, which is even a kind of pastoral notion or perhaps patriarchal notion of what protecting a collectivity would look like.
Okay, thank you very much. And we have a whole range of questions already. Let me start with Disa Lindgren. She writes, in 1972, my family lived in Tunis, Tunisia. I remember how chilling it was to learn that the father of one of my brother's classmates was a former US police officer working to train police in Tunis. My mother met this police advisor on several occasions and commented that it was no wonder his son was a bully, because the father spoke with such contempt about Tunisians. My question, you shared that the US police advisory program began in the 1960s. Do you know whose idea it was and what prompted it?
Yeah, wow, that's an incredible story, and it sounds like this person that you're mentioning was a member of the Office of Public Safety, and we could probably find his name. So please do feel free to get in touch with me, send me an email, and I'd love to have a conversation with you. The idea for the Office of Public Safety came about, as I show in the book, initially with the occupations of Japan and Germany after World War II, when the United States sent, a lot of resources to those countries to rebuild their police forces from the ground up. The principle was that they should have police forces that were more like the US police rather than the police that had been in existence before the war in those places. This model was then kind of made mobile and applied then to other countries. It really comes into existence in end of 1954 during the Eisenhower administration. It's mostly under the auspices of the CIA. And the first two countries to receive this type of assistance are South Vietnam and Indonesia. Soon it spreads to places in Latin America. Iran was another big early recipient. And the creation of the Office of Public Safety is the kind of brainchild of a couple of people who are affiliated with the CIA. I focus on two of them in the book. One is a guy named Byron Engel, who had been a police officer in Kansas City. He becomes the director of OPS for the majority of its existence. So I focus on Byron Engel, and then I focus on another guy whose name is Robert Comer, who was a CIA guy who then is working in the National Security Council. And he is kind of Byron Engel's main protector and defender, and the kind of conduit between Engel and the Oval Office during the Kennedy and Johnson administrations. Comer goes on to be quite well known for his role in the war in Vietnam, but he had a very important role in kind of creating the Office of Public Safety and designing it. And there were really strong debates within the national security sector among intelligence officials about whether the Office of Public Safety was the kind of cure for the problem being communist subversion around the globe, or there should be some other solution to it. And those debates were never really adequately resolved. Instead, they created the Office of Public Safety, they invested in some other methods, and the Cold War raged.
Right. Stuart, we still have a lot of questions and not much time, so I'm going to ask you to keep your answers concise. The next one is by David Livingston. He writes, with the ending of the Vietnam War in the 1970s, we saw a large number of veterans join police departments across the US. Do you see a similar trend developing as the war on terror winds down? And what are the risks of modern counterinsurgency tactics entering police forces today, which are already militarized to a large extent?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of, and particularly more like a decade ago, there were a lot of stories in newspapers about veterans of, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan coming into police forces, bringing language like the surge, we should have a surge in policing, or we should use counterinsurgency theory to fight crime. There's a kind of famous story in Springfield, Massachusetts, where some state troopers, claim to apply counterinsurgency theory. So this absolutely is happening. I'm not sure that I think that veterans necessarily are the only conduits for it. Of course, veterans do matter, but there's a whole kind of sphere of intellectuals, corporations, and academics who all have interests in the transfer of these ideas. And you're right that this happened during and after the war in Vietnam. It's happening, contemporarily today. It happened, after World War II as well. Veterans make up, I would say veterans tend to make up something like a quarter to maybe a third at most of police officers in the United States. But as you pay attention to who rises through the ranks and becomes leaders in police forces, I think veterans tend to be overrepresented, although I think some of these data are hard to come by. So there's always more room for research on this.
Thank you. Next question is from Charles Chu. Black radical scholars like Charis Burnham-Stelly, Gerald Horne, and others, going back to W.E.B. Du Bois, have drawn deep connections between US anti-communism and anti-blackness. How did this manifest itself in the apparatus of both domestic policing and US-backed counterinsurgency during the Cold War? And what echoes do we see today in both Trump and Biden's designations of domestic violent extremists and attacks on socialist or counter-hegemonic forces abroad?
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question, and something that I try to explore at length in the book. You know, I would say that the understanding of the figures I look at in the book of what the communist threat looks like overseas is a funny amalgam of ideas about what the Soviet Union might do with ideas, you know, what it might do in other places with what the Soviet Union might do in the United States. And as soon as you start entering onto that terrain, you're talking about Black radicalism in the United States, because there were such strong fears that Black radicals from the 20s, 30s forward were under the influence of the Soviet Union. So policing experts, many of whom that I look at studied under, you know, J. Edgar Hoover's FBI. They went to the FBI Academy. They employed these racist tropes, which were anti-communist tropes, and anti-communist tropes, which were racist tropes. They employed them in their making sense of the world within the United States and across the globe. It's unavoidable,
right.
Even as they, I think, for many of them, they're really trying to be to adopt a kind of liberal, racially liberal ideology that's consistent with what you would find within the State Department, you know, from the late 40s forward. So it's complicated and really worth our attention.
Right. Next question is by Rachel Zhu. She writes, fantastic dialogue. Thank you, Stuart, for writing the book. You mentioned racism didn't disappear when the US police officers were deployed abroad. Could you talk a bit more about how the color line of ideology or human belief, red or not red, and the color line of human skin were related, and how this operated in the US police officers' practices abroad? The two color lines were related in the domestic context too, and how this figured in domestic policing.
Yeah, well, you know, I've just spoken a little bit about it. I mean,
Right,
I guess I would say
exactly.
that there's one line, you know, it's the same line, the color line, as you put it, of kind of, you know, the US versus the Soviet Union, and the US versus a kind of global anti-colonial movement that is also the movement within the United States of Black Power and other movements at the time. You know, these are really the same from the perspective of the police experts that I look at. And, you know, it's interesting, you know, they're on the one hand, students of Soviet practice and communist ideology. You know, they're reading, you know, they're reading their Lenin in some ways, but they come out of the experience of policing Jim Crow America. You know, again, as I said, they're cops who mainly come of age from the 40s into the 50s and the 60s. So what they think police reform looks like and what they think police tasks should be are, you know, really formed in the crucible of the labor struggles in the United States of the 40s after World War II into the 1950s, which are, you know, deeply shaped and, you know, etched by the configuration of racism and Jim Crow laws within the United States. So you know, I would just kind of emphasize that you know, we should think of those two lines that you mentioned as really one line. I think that's the kind of upshot of some of the analysis I do in the book.
Right. Thank you very much. It's about time, but we still have, I think, two interesting questions left.
Sure.
So let's add a few minutes, if that is okay.
Absolutely.
The first one is by Roderick Mitchener, and he asks, this is outside the temporal space of your research, but I wonder if you can speak to the connection between US counterinsurgency in El Salvador and the creation and growth of MS-13 within the El Salvadoran diaspora of Los Angeles.
Yeah, you're right that is a little bit outside my own expertise. However, the police assistance program, Office of Public Safety, was shut down by Congress, as I mentioned, in 74, 75. The United States gets back into the business of police assistance through a kind of exception to the congressional ban in El Salvador. The person who is kind of most well known or most clearly associated with the creation of death squads in El Salvador, Roberto de Buisson, he's thought to have been a student at the International Police Academy, a recipient of US police assistance through the Office of Public Safety. So even though the program itself is outlawed, there are strong continuities to the kind of reactivation, the reheating of the Cold War during the Reagan era. And police assistance comes back online. And I've done a little bit of research about what this looked like when it kind of comes back. And what it turns out is that, some of the most brutal groups of the security apparatus within El Salvador during the 80s, were the ones that had been created by the Office of Public Safety, or really bolstered by the Office of Public Safety, in the 60s and 70s. Now, the connection between that and MS-13, I think, is quite complicated. And I would just say that, part of the story here is really that so many people had to flee the horrific violence from El Salvador. They came to the United States, and then they were the recipients of really harsh policing and incarceration within the United States, which led to the formation of various types of street organizations. They were then deported back to Central America, and this is kind of the origin story for MS-13. I'd recommend a recent book by Roberto Lovato on this. It's a kind of memoir. He has really incredible experiences that he writes about, and a really sharp analytic eye. So I would recommend Roberto Lovato's book on that.
Great, thank you. Last question by Jumbo Lee is short, but could provoke an hour-long response. I'm going to read it nonetheless. What do you consider the core essential functions of policing within capitalist liberal democracies? Yeah,
there's a lot of course, a lot of literature on this. I've been really inspired, as I know many others of my colleagues have been, by the recent work of Mark Neoclaus, whose book was just republished by Verso on police power. And he makes the argument that I think a lot of us have adopted, which is that policing is historically, going back centuries, about the fabrication of a social order of wage labor. And of course, wage labor also implies a kind of class of people who are in the sort of reserve, who are a surplus population. So in addition to making sure that workers are ready, willing, and able to work for a wage, there's also another population that has to be willing to come into wage labor, but may not be working for a wage at any given moment. That's managing that surplus population is the other core task of policing. Now, of course, we know police protect private property, enforce property rights, enforce various forms of capitalist power. So it's in some ways it's easy to talk about in these kind of abstract, somewhat abstract or theoretical terms, but it's also, you know, how it plays out on the ground in various places. I think, you know, there's many similarities and patterns, but there are also some specific details that I think are always worth taking close, you know, paying close attention to. So, you know, it's necessary to do on the ground research in addition to, you know, reading the kind of political theory that I think many of us have been influenced by. And so that's kind of where I sit, is, you know, trying to translate the findings I, you know, find in my empirical research through this kind of theoretical framework. And, you know, and it's on some level, it's challenging. On another level, it's also kind of obvious that this is what police do, you know, and I don't think that any of us really could you know, deny it when we're looking at what police are doing around the globe.
Absolutely. So Stuart, I want to thank you very, very much for a wonderful conversation.
Yeah, thanks so much. It's been great. These were really wonderful questions, everybody. So thank you for this today.
Right. So our next Cold War Spaces interview will be in 2 weeks, August 25th. And my guest is Deborah Capel, research scholar and lecturer in the sociology department at Princeton University. And we are going to talk about socialist friendship space, Soviet advisors in communist China. I hope to see you there, and have a wonderful 2 weeks.